We are finishing up today this Advent series, this short four-part series called Follow Your Dreams. We've been talking about there are four instances in the opening chapters of Matthew's Gospel that surround the birth story of Jesus, and in which, if those four instances, people receive messages from God in the form of dreams. So this is not your typical follow your dreams, rah, rah, you can do it, never give up, believe in yourself. This is follow your dreams in the biblical sense. In these passages, we've been learning that actually to follow your dreams in this way actually means that your life gets redirected. And if you're visiting with us and today's message sort of spikes some interest in you, you can go to our website and all the previous messages in the series are there and you can check them out at any time. But today, we're going to be talking about restarting. How we see a life that gets an opportunity, a challenging opportunity, to restart as Jesus and Mary and Joseph return to Nazareth. So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2, just a few verses to read right at the outset this morning from verse 19 to verse 23, and it reads like this. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who are trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, where he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. And so was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. And you probably noticed, just from reading that passage, you get a 2-for-1 deal today. 2 dreams for the price of 1. You know, the dream that initially is it's okay to go home back to Israel, and then a second dream that says, well, maybe not that part of Israel, maybe a different part of Israel. So, we're going to dig into that journey back, the journey home, and maybe what it looked like for Mary and Joseph and Jesus. But before we get to that, I want to talk just a little bit about how Mary and Joseph and Jesus got to this point, right? Because in a very short time, Mary and Joseph bounced around from place to place an awful lot. From Nazareth to Bethlehem for the birth of Jesus. From Bethlehem to Jerusalem and back for Jesus to be dedicated 40 days after he was born. From Bethlehem to Egypt in order to flee from Herod when Jesus was likely around 18 months old or so. And then the stay in Egypt was anywhere from a few months to a couple of years, scholars believe, and then the journey once again back from Egypt to Israel. That's a lot of bouncing around from place to place in a very short amount of time. Now, not for us today. You know, we hear about people making those sorts of trips in a span of about 3 years, and we go, so what? I go from here to PA, from here to Indiana, from here to Florida, from here to Texas, Arizona. I know some of you travel for work, and you're like, I do that kind of stuff all the time, right? But in this day and age, when Jesus was born, it was very, very different. You didn't travel a ton, especially if you're someone of Mary and Joseph's station, because almost certainly, having grown up in Nazareth, these are rural, poorer kids. They probably, in their village in Nazareth, they probably were all born there, grew up there, and pretty much died there. Maybe you travel back and forth to Jerusalem for a festival or a feast, and maybe there's some family or friends in the vicinity, but for the most part, by and large, at this time, a family like this would have never bounced around quite like this. And all that bouncing around led me to this question that I want to trouble you with this morning. Have you ever lived out of a suitcase for any extended period of time? Anybody been there where you live out of a suitcase for days, weeks, or months? And let's be honest, traveling can be fun and adventurous and exciting for a while. I remember when I was in grad school doing seminary through George Fox, and I would travel once a semester every fall and every spring and fly out to Portland, Oregon, and be able to spend 8 or 9 days there at any given time. And there is something unique and fun and adventurous about traveling and doing things like that. But typically, near the end of that time away, I just wanted to stop living out of a suitcase. Because doing that can be very, very taxing and can be exhausting. If you've ever been away from home, by the time you get to the end of that time, there's really only one place you want to be, and it's back home again. And I think, I would argue that we are actually wired or designed, if you will, to seek out home. I think that we are designed and created to seek out a place of settledness, a place of familiarity. I mean, think about it. The story of the Garden of Eden, God does not create Adam and Eve and then say, go, roam around, right? He gives them a place. I actually think we are wired to seek out a place we can call home, a place of settledness. And modern sociology agrees. A couple quotes from an article I read this week. Whether or not we are always aware of it, a home is a home because it blurs the line between the self and the surroundings and challenges the line we try to draw between who we are and where we are. There's something about home that deeply connects who we are with that place. The article went on. For many people, their home is part of their self-definition, which is why we do things like decorate our houses and take care of our lawns. These large patches of vegetation serve little real purpose, but they're part of a public face people put on, displaying their home as an extension of themselves. And you know this is true, right? I don't have to tell you. I mean, think about this. Every ounce, every shred of decorating you have done inside your home is completely optional. All of it. Your house would be perfectly functional with zero decoration whatsoever. So why do we decorate the place we call home if it's completely non-functional? Because it's an extension of ourselves. We create a place of restedness, of settledness, a place where we can feel at ease and at peace, and is an extension of ourselves. I love it that this quote mentions not only the decoration, but the lawns. Because listen, I'm not going to point fingers or ask you to raise hands, but some of you lawn people, you just need to take a breath and a step back from the edge. It's going to be okay. I promise. Right? But those lawns that we have, they serve, we're not raising crops there. They serve no functional purpose. And yet, for some of us, there's this drive to have them well manicured and well trimmed, and the garden this, and the flower beds that. Why? Because it's home. Because there is this connection between who we are and where we are when we are at home, right? That's why I would argue that just being a human being, we have this built-in sense to seek out home, to seek out a place of settledness. This time of year, there are a lot of movies, television shows. I'm sure you've read a book here or there, where this getting home for the holidays, again, drives this point home all over again, right? We take these stories of being home for the holidays, and they just strike a chord within us, right? Now, you guys recognize this. Please tell me I'm not the only one. I mean, classic 1980s comedy. To me, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is like the pinnacle of the all-too-short actoral life of John Candy. And that story, I snuck it in. It's actually about getting home for Thanksgiving, not Christmas. But just this whole idea of seeking home, of desperately wanting to get home. And if 1980s John Candy's not your thing, maybe your thing is, and there's probably some of you here today, the whole Hallmark Channel. Do you know how many of those movies this time of year are about going back home? About 1 billion of them, right? It's a common theme because it's a common feeling to be human, is to seek home, to seek a place like that. There's a certain settledness about coming back home that allows us to think about restarting our lives. If you've been away for a long time and you come home, you get a little bit of a restart. If you've been away for a really long time, maybe even years, you definitely come back home and there's a restart. I would argue that even at the micro level, coming home every day at the end of a day and being settled in your home gives you the ability to restart even just for the next day. We are drawn to home and the sense of settledness that it can bring to us. Mary and Joseph are heading home, back to Nazareth, back to where they had grown up. But I would bet that home looks nothing like it did when they left. I believe that they see home through completely new eyes. Imagine returning to Nazareth if you are them, and how different home might have looked. How differently the surroundings might have been. The last time when they left Nazareth, they were setting off temporarily because there was a census that they needed to be somewhere else for, and their biggest concern at the time was whether or not the baby would be born along the side of the road. And now the circle that they've traveled, the Bethlehem thing, the Magi thing, the shepherds thing, the trip to Egypt and back, I have to believe that Nazareth looks completely different. Even though there's some familiarity, it has to look different. I think about it in terms like this. There's a place when I go back to it, it always feels and looks different, even though it's a familiar place. It's when I go back to my old high school. So I grew up in Winona. I was a United Eagle from kindergarten all the way through graduation. And occasionally, less and less these days, but I have the opportunity to go back and to be there. And I don't know about you, it's probably different for all of us, but when I go back to my old high school and I enter into that building, everything feels smaller. All of it. The hallways seem narrower and shorter. The lunchroom used to feel this big, and now it feels like a lunch box. I feel like I could touch both walls at one time. Even the lockers, you walk through the hallways, and the lockers look smaller to me. Now, it's still a place of familiarity, and I walk through, and these memories, light up left and right. So even though it's familiar, though, it looks totally different than last time I was there. It looks totally different. I remember what it looked like when I was a nervous, anxiety-filled, teenage, awkward boy. And now, as a slightly less anxiety-filled adult, it seems different. I see it through new eyes, through different lenses. And I think that all of that goes to this idea that there are seasons of life. I went through a season of life at my high school that I still have memories of, and it's a place of familiarity, but I have traveled through so many seasons of life since then that when I go back, it's the same place, but it doesn't look like the same place. Mary and Joseph had a long season of life in Nazareth before Mary's pregnancy, where they grew up there. Then a short season in Bethlehem, probably staying with relatives after Jesus' birth. And then another short season of life in Egypt, where they were living as refugees in a strange place. And now there's a new season of life beginning in Nazareth. They're restarting in a familiar place. And maybe some of that familiarity is comfortable, but they are not the same people as when they left. Their life experiences had to have changed them. And so this restart, this new season of life, will have some familiarity, but a lot of newness. And the idea of seasons of life, of course, brings you back to the passage that you probably heard before, the opening verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear, a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And what do workers gain from their toil? I've seen the burden God has laid on the human race, and he has made everything beautiful in its time, but he's also set eternity in the human heart. There were a lot of seasons represented in what we just read, and maybe we got to one or two of them and you kind of went, oh, wow, yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I'm not there, but boy, I really feel like I'm there. One of the things I love this week in reading this passage afresh and anew is that there are these seasons that we kind of bounce and flow in between, really, in our entire lives. But I love the end of what we read today, that he has set eternity in the human heart. which I think is a reminder that there will always be a sense of restlessness on this side of eternity. That we have eternity set in our hearts. Therefore, as wonderful as home might feel, there is an unsettledness. St. Augustine of Hippo put it this way: our hearts are restless until they can find rest in God. So Mary and Joseph, traveling back, arriving in Nazareth. And really two big things about this trip back that I want to hit on this morning. That they're going back to Nazareth, and that it's actually a place of humble beginnings. If you think the manger in Bethlehem is humble, this is also humble. It seems initially, though, until warned in the second dream to avoid it, Joseph was going to take his family to Judea. The initial dream just said, it's okay, it's safe. Those who are trying to take the child's life are gone. You can go back to Israel. That's a very general place, the land of Israel. And Joseph, for whatever reason, said, great, we're going back to Judea. And that's where we should stop as readers and go, why? Why Judea? Judea is not where Joseph and Mary were from. They're from Nazareth. Judea is not where they hung out with relatives after Jesus' birth. That's Bethlehem. Why are they going back and landing in Judea? And I have a speculation after some of the studying that I did this week, and here's my speculation. Judea is where Jerusalem is. Plain and simple. I wonder if enough time has passed for this family, enough wild and unique and miraculous things have happened in the lives of Mary and Joseph and Jesus. At this point, maybe they started to place Jesus and even themselves on a little bit of a pedestal, because if Herod was right to be threatened by this one that was born a king and now Herod is gone, then maybe, just maybe, they want to situate themselves around the proximity where their son can take the throne that rightfully belongs to him. If he was born a king, it makes sense that you settle in or near the royal city of Jerusalem. And it's understandable that they would be thinking that. The experiences they've gone through, the direction just keeps pointing them towards that end. It doesn't make them bad that they sort of want to get to Judea, closer to Jerusalem, but I would say this: they were getting ahead of the story that God was telling just a little bit. Because if you know the rest of the Jesus story, yes, he eventually will get to Jerusalem. But there's a lot of stuff that has to happen before that time. They weren't wrong, they were just getting ahead of God just a little bit. And I think we do the same thing today. I think sometimes we try and outpace God a little bit in our lives. There's a combination that comes into our lives of gifting and talent, either of us or other people, and we build expectation and opportunity, and we get ahead of ourselves just a little bit. And I was thinking about that, expectation and opportunity and giftedness and talent, and I just had this random thought. This is like the ultimate story of what it means to be a Cleveland sports fan. Like, you get to the point where you have, enough talent, enough gifting, and then this optimism and opportunity, and you get yourself a little bit ahead of where you actually are. And pretty soon you turn around and you're 6-8 and probably trading Francisco Lindor, and I'm already mad, and it hasn't even happened yet. I'm already angry. Sometimes we get out ahead of the story. We want to unfold it before the story itself unfolds. But Joseph is warned, don't go to Judea. It's not safe. Archelaus is the ruler there. That's the son of Herod the Great. So the guy that tried to kill Jesus is gone. But Archelaus is actually worse. Historically, he was actually worse than Herod. And we talked last week about how crazy and unstable Herod was. Archelaus was worse, to the point that the Romans, who didn't require a lot of mercy from the rulers they had in place, the Romans saw what he was doing. He was so unstable and unhinged, they deposed him and exiled him to France, called Gaul at the time. They got him as far away as they possibly could. So Joseph receives the message, don't go back there. It's worse than when you left. Instead, we're told that he goes to Galilee, where a man named Herod Antipas is ruling, another one of Herod the Great's sons. And he has his own faults, which you can read all about in the Gospels, but he's at least not nearly the tyrant that Archelaus is. But here's the other interesting thing about landing in Galilee, about not being in Judea near Jerusalem, but instead Galilee and Nazareth. The passage that we read today concluded with this phrase: he would be called a Nazarene. That Jesus would be called a Nazarene. Now we read that and we're like, of course, that all happened so we could have the hymn. Jesus the Nazarene. That's the entire reason that Jesus was in Nazareth. Well, not really, right? And here's the crazy thing. Nazareth was not anywhere that anybody wanted to be. It was virtually synonymous with the idea of being despised, looked down upon, cast aside, thought less of, right? The best thing I could come up with culturally that's comparable for us is how somebody that might be from a more prosperous urban environment looks at some of the people in our neck of the woods and goes, oh, those backwards hillbillies. Right? That's the sort of terminology, a despised, really looked down upon situation. The word Nazareth actually can be translated as stick, which is almost an insult. Instead of this place being a mighty tree, they're just a stick, which means, Jesus actually grew up in the sticks, for all that's worth, right? But it actually makes sense, because we use the phrase in the sticks to communicate a place that is inconsequential, a place that doesn't really matter, a place that really doesn't have much at all going on, and really nothing to offer. And that's the kind of place where Jesus grew up, in the sticks. Nazareth is not mentioned again in the Old or New Testament. It is inconsequential. We can read about this in Scripture itself. John chapter 1, the beginning of Jesus' ministry in that gospel, we read this. Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. So Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We found the one Moses wrote about in the law, about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And here's the response. Nazareth. Can anything good come from there? Nazareth. Worthless. Right? Just a side note, I love the response that Nathanael he says, "Come and see." Come and see. So is it possible that Mary and Joseph were trying to avoid the label that Jesus would get from growing up in Nazareth? Is that part of why maybe they thought, let's do Judea? I've heard they have way better schools and a Starbucks. So let's try that, and let's not go back to the sticks in Nazareth. And avoid that label of this one born a king being labeled as someone from Nazareth. Why would they want him to be from a despised place? They just want the best for their son. But here is just the beauty of this picture to me, is that even before he was able to make decisions for himself, Jesus was identifying with the despised. In the grand providence of God, Jesus the toddler begins his life in Nazareth among the despised, the marginalized, the lowly, the ignored, the shoved aside. Those people who would probably never amount to anything. That is where we find Jesus. Incredible. And we see previews of this in the Old Testament prophecies about Messiah. Isaiah 52. He grew up before them like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised. There's that word again. And we held him in low esteem. Nazareth. What good could come from there? And then fast forward and we see this beautiful description of the character of Christ and our need to reflect it in Philippians chapter 2. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. By taking the nature of a servant, by being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And it started in Nazareth. The one who would be lifted up as the rightful king, above and beyond all people and all things, and he begins his toddler life in Nazareth. Which leads me to this final conclusion for today. In the ordering of the world that we see in Jesus, God chooses to give authority and influence to people who have walked the path of humility. There is something about people who have walked the humble path that in God's ordering of the world can be seen as trustworthy of holding power and influence. Now, probably many of you recognize the graphic that's up there now, right? The hammer of Thor. And if I love all the Marvel movies, and if you've seen any of them, you know that in order to wield the hammer of Thor, you have to be found worthy, right? And there's a point where Thor himself is not worthy of the hammer. And so he gets sent to Earth, to a backwater Styx place compared to the place that he lives. He gets thrown into the Styx. Why? In order to learn how to be humble, in order to become worthy to wield the power that comes along with being able to pick up that hammer. I think that's a little snippet of the ordering of God in the world. That sometimes we walk the path of humility and humbleness, not as a punishment, but as an opportunity. Now, can you get power and influence and authority in other places by other means? Absolutely you can. But I would say that the God-granted power and authority comes when we are willing to walk the path of humility. And so maybe now you're in a place like that. You feel like you're restarting, you're starting over, and you're in a place that feels lowly or less than. I would argue sometimes a restart, more often than not, happens in a place that's more humble than we would like to be. And is there a better place, a better time? We're approaching the end of the year. Not only the end of the year, it's the end of the decade to be thinking about restarting, because Jesus and his family restarting in Nazareth, think about this. Jesus was there for over 25 years, laboring in obscurity, in the middle of nowhere, in the sticks, in a place of unimportance that was inconsequential to anyone else, but all that time learning and growing and being prepared for what God laid in front of him that would literally change the world. So where are you now? And where is God leading you next? A few things to think about as we close the message time today, to pray about, to reflect upon. Here's the first one. Does your home give you a sense of peace and settledness? And if not, what changes can you make to encourage that kind of environment? We are wired to seek home and the settledness that home can bring us. Secondly, what sort of season of life are you in right now? And are you in a season that feels like an opportunity to restart some aspect of your life? And lastly, is your life not what you had expected it would be at this point? And that could apply to anyone at any season of life. Does it not look like what you hoped and dreamed it would? Does it seem like you're in a place that is less than where you feel you should be? Ask God how you might need to learn and grow as he prepares you for what is coming next. And if that doesn't apply to you, maybe you know someone. You can pray for them today. Someone who is at that point where they are restarting and they might not be in a place that they ever wanted to be, but ask that God would reveal himself to them. So take a moment or two to pray, reflect. If you want to close your eyes or bow your head, you're welcome to. And I will close that time of reflective silence with a word of prayer in just a moment.